Ministry of Finance just approved that if you want to invest in Vietnam stock market, you don't need to pre-fund your account. So that's a major lifting and would be in place in November this year. So that helped us become candidate for this market upgrade to take place in 2025 or early 2026 to be recognized as an emerging market. And Ministry of Finance also have a lot of ambitions. So they want to grow the financial market to make Vietnam financial market more transparent, of course, more liquidity as well. We're trying to encourage more foreign investors to coming in, not just invest in infrastructure project, but also stock markets, public equity market, making the financial market in Vietnam more mature.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. You don't want to miss Geeks on a Beach, the unique premier startup conference in the region. Join us from November 13th to 15, 2024 at J Park Island Resort in Mactan, Cebu. This event brings together tech enthusiasts, investors, and entrepreneurs for 3 days of workshops, talks, and networking. Register at geeksonabeach.com and use code BRAVEC for a 45% discount for the first 10 registrations and 35% off for the next ones. Hello, Valerie.
Hi, Jeremy.
Well, it's always nice that instead of Vietnam internet connection where the cable seems to be very slow, we get to do this in person because we keep visiting Singapore. So you get to join me in the home studio. So what brings you to town?
I guess the conference week bring me to town. I think 10, 12 days of consecutively like events and conferences.
Yeah, so there's a F1 race, the Token 2049, Milken Conference, Super Returns, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. And then the AGMs are here as well. A lot of VCs have moved their annual general meetings to this time season because their global LPs are in town. So even though it's not necessarily fits exactly with their fiscal year, this is taken as their AGM because nobody's going to make a trip in September from America and then come back for your November, December AGM.
Yeah, I guess September is like Singapore month, September, Singapore.
Yeah. It's also my month of my birthday.
Oh, yeah. Happy birthday.
I'm always so extroverted out because it's like this month, there's so many events. So I'm normally an extrovert. After this month is done, I'm just like a massive introvert. I'm just in bed reading my book. I'm so tired meeting people.
It's only once a year, so gotta show up.
Definitely. I was at the One Republic concert last night and there was a massive thunderstorm. It's Asia weather. So oh well.
Yeah, talk about the thunderstorm. Yeah, I was catching up with my friend at La Paz last night, and we were stuck in a thunderstorm for 2-3 hours.
Oh, from 10 plus p.m. Yeah, so that was a One Republic concert. So my sister and I were enjoying One Republic. And then the storm, the locals understood it first. So we were the first one to exits. And all the tourists were like, why is there so many people leaving just when the music is getting good? And then it became a giant storm. But of course, that storm is nothing compared to what Vietnam went through, right?
Yeah. So a week ago, we were hit by a major like super typhoon called Yagi that hit mostly northern part of Vietnam, where usually severe weather doesn't really hit the north part of Vietnam. It's usually only the central. But that was like the first time in the history, like the last 30 years, we experienced that severe damage from a super typhoon. So the Typhoon Yagi damaged a lot of building properties, even killed over 300 people because the typhoon brought in like a lot of landslides and severe flooding. So economy was also heavily impacted. Not only like we lost over 300 people, we also estimate that direct damage from the typhoon is at least 1.6 billion US dollar because actually the typhoon collapses a bridge, a major bridge in the north.
Oh no. Okay.
Yeah. And when the typhoon was already gone, the flooding lasted for over a week. So a lot of factory and even offices didn't have electricity for a week straight. So the indirect damage, we cannot really estimate exactly yet, but the direct damage is the $1.6 billion. The economists are expecting that the GDP growth of Vietnam this year will probably be hit and decreased by 0.15%.
Oh no. And just early this year, we were discussing they were optimistic about the growth rate this year, but that's such a shame.
Yeah, so no one can predict a typhoon that hit the northern part, which contribute majorly to the economy of Vietnam. So yeah, it was a really saddening period. A lot of people lost entire home, their net worth, like properties. The entire village in Lao Cai, a province in Lao Cai, even got hit by landslide. So the entire village got wiped out in overnight.
I think it's such a shame. And I think the awkward reality is a lot of it happens in Southeast Asia, right? I think people forget that the tsunami did happen, the big one around the Christmas period, impacted Thailand, Indonesia, many places across Asia. So that's one. Then obviously with typhoon. So I think there's something that people underappreciate because that weather pattern obviously is part of the monsoon season, which is what allowed for early trade between China and Southeast Asia with India and then India with Europe. So I think it's always created that trade. But like you said, because of the typhoons, the weather patterns, as well as obviously the seismic activity, right, for earthquakes, there's actually quite a lot of, if you are outside Asia or you're not even very familiar with it, in the business sense, you tend to get surprised by it because in the news makes it like, wow, it just happened. But I think for us in business, it's almost like a known unknown. It's like, we know it's going to happen every year, every other year, every 3 years. So I think you have to price in that risk.
Like I mentioned, usually the typhoon usually only hit the central Vietnam. So the northern population was underprepared whenever an event like that happened. So yeah, we did not expect that kind of like hit Vietnam. Very sudden, tough moment for the country. But I think Vietnamese people are really resilient and we are coming back strong. But I think moving forward, even not just the central part, but northern and the entire Vietnam have to be more stronger built for another typhoon coming, for example. There might be another one coming this year.
Yeah, I think the problem is safety is written in blood, right? So all your precautions, every rule you see on the construction site is because something went wrong in the past, right? So I think a lot of Southeast Asia, a lot of the building codes, the requirements for like even the stability of the house during a seismic event around Indonesia, a lot of it is, there's a lot of active volcanoes. Southeast Asia, all the islands and everything. So a lot of it has to be, it's like the disaster happens, then the government takes action, starts installing the tsunami alarms and starts training people. It's like that. And I think that's why people underappreciate Singapore to some extent, because Singapore is actually one of the few countries in Southeast Asia that is very rare to have weather adverse events. Because if you look at the position of it, it's like you're talking about tsunami or you're talking about typhoon, like you need a very large expanse of water to pick up speed and velocity and so forth. But actually, Singapore is sheltered by the Indonesian main islands, and then it's also sheltered by Malaysia. So actually, there are very few ways for a storm to pick up the energy. And of course, Singapore is in a stable part that's not seismically active as well. So I think it's like one of those. It's like I don't think people are like, oh, Singapore is so good because it's not in a seismic zone. It's not the plus point, but I think people kind of like underappreciate was the not having that risk factor that happens.
I would say still be careful because like after the typhoon, Quảng province, which is a really wealthy province in the north, their main construction sites such as like city museums and also it's like big museums in another like stadium completely gone, completely destroyed. And it's a major tourism destination for Vietnam. That's where Halong Bay is. So I would say always be extra careful and vigilant.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is that in Asia, back in the medieval ages, there was a mini ice age that was caused by a Southeast Asian and I think Indonesian volcano exploding called Krakatoa. It was a mega eruption. It released so much particles in the air that the whole people in Europe were like, wow, the skies changed color. And then after that, the whole earth cooled and then there was less sunlight and then the plants died. Then the crops failed and then he set the foundation for like civil war, revolution, and disease epidemics in Europe as well. So that's interesting where all these like, there could be a super volcano explosion. It's obviously Asia, right? And I think it's
could be.
I mean, maybe once every 500 years, every 1,000 years, but you never know. So there you are going through this disaster and so forth. What else is happening in the Vietnam market?
I would say this quarter has been extremely tough for Vietnam market. Not only experienced a terrible typhoon in the past 30 years, but we also saw a few bad news for the ecosystem, like tech startup ecosystem in Vietnam. The first one relating to the first unicorn in Vietnam, VNG. Earlier in September, police very suddenly raided the VNG campus. And as a result, they have to change the CEO to Kelly Wong. And because the current CEO is with the police. However, the public relation team of VNG has done a really great job. And all of the article domestically about VNG got like took down in one day. So what's the reason of this mystery investigation? We still don't know. There's a lot of conspiracies and story theories, but I'm sure that they didn't do anything wrong. I hope so. And VNG is getting back to normal business because right now they have an interim CEO in place already. It just caused a lot of questioning, more concerns from investor community, especially on the tech investment side.
Yeah, and we've talked about it in our past episodes. I think that Vietnam has a very strong set of macros around the economy, and that sets the foundation for many small businesses, including startups, to grow. Of course, the tricky part is that in order for early stage venture capital to be there, they need to believe there's growth stage venture capital, and growth stage venture capital needs there to be a public market exit.
Yeah.
And I think one way of looking at it is that there is no history of there having been public market exit for a tech unicorn. And VNG was supposed to be that one that was supposed to list in the US. And so I think that's a dampener, obviously. And of course, I think the sub-factors of that is the bear perspective of their VNG not being able to go on market is because they're concerned about political action. Because similar to the Chinese approach, right? It's like you have a certain governance structure and then you have to list in the US through a parallel listing. Anyway, but the legal mechanism of that is a little bit fragile, similar to the Chinese approach. And it basically requires your domestic government to be like, I'm okay with it. Which if they're not, then it kills the late stage exit potential.
I'm sure they will work out a solution. It makes no sense to hold the CEO for too long time. The entire tech ecosystem, it's on VNG side and then hoping that they will release the CEO. Yeah.
No easy answers. I mean, like I said, I've heard a lot of conspiracy theories as well. I actually don't really know. I mean, I think that they say, some say fraud, some say political faction alignment, some of them say other personal items. So it's very unclear. But I think the problem, is opacity doesn't help, I think, because in America, normally when there's police action, there's more clarity around the reason. And so now, whether you believe it's fraud or not, for example, like WeWork, or you look at Terranos, I mean, as an example, all these different types of lawsuits, etc. I think they tend to name it upfront. And I think the truth is the market can actually absorb bad news, actually. Like the market can be like, okay, Luckin Coffee is publicly listed, and it can absorb the fact that, okay, the stock price will drop, it will be delisted, etc. But I think fuzziness is actually the worst of all information states.
I still believe it's not fraud, but until we have clear confirmations or answer from the government, we don't know exactly why. I would prefer not to putting more conspiracy in the situation right now.
Yeah. So I think a lot is riding on VNG because I think if the VNG doesn't make an exit eventually, then the question is what kind of unicorn can? Because VNG, we talked about a company before, it really has that super app / virtual digital conglomerate. Like he has all the right arms, he has the free cash flows, he has the games, he has the chats, he has the payments, he has the shopping. So it's really got, I think, everything needed for a good public market story. Yeah. So let's see how that turns out. So we'll discuss it next time if we get more news about it.
Yeah, we get more clarity.
Yeah. And then you were discussing about the stock market as well, right?
I think before we move into stock market, one more news that I would like to discuss is another major startup player left Vietnam, is GoJek. So right now the ride-hailing market in Vietnam is getting very consolidated. So last year was Baemin leaving Vietnam, and then this year is GoJek, even though they have been in the market for 6 years and invested quite a lot. I'm pretty sure they already spent over 200 million in Vietnam market. So they were one of the latest international startups that announced and decided to leave Vietnam.
Yeah. I would say, I don't think it's really bad news for Vietnam. I would say it's more like it makes sense for GoJek from my perspective. GoJek, if you look at the public financials, they are listed on IDX. They're still burning a lot of cash. And so Vietnam as a market has been profitable really for either Grab or GoJek as a market because of its fast growing GDP per capita, but it's still relatively low, which means pricing power is low. Then you have a lot of people competing, so it's hard to raise prices. I think everybody's been losing money in the Vietnam market. So it's really like Grab versus GoJek, seeing who can stay longer. And I think he goes back, and I was talking to a former GoJek employee, and he was basically saying that as an executive, they knew that Vietnam wasn't a good market for them because they felt like there's more to do in Indonesia. They need to focus their technology and the resources. And Indonesia is big enough as a market with 300 million people. You just got to build more business lines. But I think they really wanted a regional story to talk to public market investors, similar to Grab, because then that's how you get US interest, etc. And so they felt like Vietnam was a good fit. So I think going in was really to help them fundraise. I was quite proud of the story. But whether, I think everybody knew coming in that it was going to be difficult to get the ROI on it. And then once you're in, it's actually quite hard to get out. I think there's a story for a lot of markets, for a lot of startups. It's like, if you're in a market, it's quite difficult to get out because you lose face, you get to explain to people, and blah, blah, blah. So you end up a lot of sunk costs. But if you ask me, I think it's the right call. They already pruned back. So they sold Tokopedia to the ByteDance team. Then they are letting go of the Vietnam business unit. So I think they're really focusing on the core units they have in Indonesia.
Yeah, so we have a lot of ride-hailing and food delivery player who already left. So in most recently, GoJek.
Yeah, I mean, I think food delivery and rides were basically subsidized by all these Singaporean, American, and Indonesian capital. I mean, if you look at it, it's like $200 million spent in the Vietnam market, basically $200 million in subsidy to the local market for competition and so forth. Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see where Grab can actually eventually dominate the entire market. So right now they're almost like 50%, and the rest of the market is divided between B and Green SM. Which is the subsidiary owned by VinFast. My hypothesis is B and VinFast will collaborate even further and maybe push. Like Grab will have another tough battle with the domestic players.
I think so. I think if you look at most of these markets, it goes back to it. It's just like the tricky part for companies to go regional is that at the end of the day, a Vietnamese government may look at this as a Singaporean company. And so, or your domestic competitors may look at this as a foreign competitor. And so it's not like America, where it's like Uber can grow from San Francisco to New York and then from New York to Utah. Like it's still an American company, even though it's from a different state. So I think like competition. But let's see how it goes. I mean, even with Lyft and Uber, it's still a duopoly, but once you have network effects, it can be quite strong and hard to break those network effects. Uber is slowly killing Lyft right now, just because it's larger. So I think there's a chance that Grab will be leveraging its network effects and its technology stack just to push. So it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. But I think there's enough space for two players in a market. Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, but if B and Fast like shake hand further, there will be two, but there will be like two domestic players.
Yeah, it will just end up being like Grab versus some domestic super alliance. I mean, I think this makes sense. I mean, it's consolidation. And then we already know that for a while. Everybody in Asia knew that consolidation is happening. I mean, even Grab and GoJek are supposedly in secret discussions to potentially merge. Of course, the problem is it's a secret discussion, but obviously everybody is leaking into the news.
That talk has been ongoing in town for several years.
Yeah. Well, I wanted them to merge a long time ago. They invested in both sides. And I think it made sense years ago for them to merge because consolidated, they both would have got a nice payout at that time. And then they would have been able to raise prices. I think the deal made sense back then, but obviously the individual negotiating teams couldn't come to an agreement, right? So be it. But let's see. I think this time around is a little bit different, like high interest rates. It's hard to get external funding. You know, these are public market companies. Grab is still run by the founder. GoJek is being run by a professional CEO who's really on top of it. But it's less personal rivalry / history in that sense. So maybe this time around, something could happen. But I think I'll be very interested to see what the regulators will say for Grab and GoJek merging. It wouldn't matter for Vietnam because GoJek already exited. But I think Indonesia regulator and the Singapore regulators will probably have a lot to say.
So it will be a shake hand of two countries instead of
just that's the most important conversation between the two regulators, actually, I would say, whether that's doable. Because every merger is not an equal merger in life. So it depends on who's on top, I think.
Yeah. I guess regulator has been more difficult in a lot of M&A transaction, at least in the US side.
I think the regulators are also an issue in Southeast Asia. I mean, it's just that, are you working on domestic action because you're linked to the local politics, or whether it's anti-foreigner action? So we saw Indonesia also had 200% import tariffs on Chinese manufactured goods because the middle class is shrinking right now.
Interested to hear more about it.
Yeah, so Gita and I, who's another co-host, will be discussing that at a past episode of ours. But I think the tricky part is like you have all these external economy shocks that we all face: inflation, supply chain disruption, China's +1. Okay, they're benefiting from China's +1, but for countries like Indonesia, there's a lot of Chinese manufacturers are trying to export to Indonesia. That's hard to compete. How do you make a pot cheaper than the Chinese factory now? Just because it's possible. So you have your nice little middle class lifestyle with a small factory, and it's getting killed by Chinese pots. I don't know. Not an easy policy debate.
Yeah. In terms of better news, Vietnam stock market and financial market have been trying to upgrade ourselves from frontier market to emerging market. Because right now, MSCI and FTSE are still classifying Vietnam stock market as a frontier market. So that kind of limit a lot of foreign public equity investors. And this year alone, the outflow of foreign market from like stock market in Vietnam like the outflow of foreign investors have been almost like 2 billion. Yeah. So everyone have been talking about when are we getting upgraded to emerging market status. And the good news is it might be coming really soon, maybe even like 2025 or early 2026.
Yeah.
Because the Ministry of Finance just made a major approval that foreign investor don't have to pre-fund their account before making a purchase in Vietnam public equities. Before, they have to have like the money in the bank account, like they have to pre-fund the account before making the purchase decision. So a lot of investors might take foreign exchange risk if they end up not buying the securities. So that stopped a lot of foreign investors from buying stock in Vietnam. But yeah, Ministry of Finance just approved that, hey, if you want to invest in Vietnam stock market, you don't need to pre-fund your account anymore. So that's a major lifting and would be in place in November this year. So that's also a major lift that helped us become candidate for this market upgrade finally to take place in 2025 or early 2026 to be recognized as an emerging market. And Ministry of Finance also have a lot of ambitions. So right now the market capitalization of Vietnam stock market is below 100% of our. They want next year the market cap of Vietnam to be 100% of Vietnam GDP, and by 2030 it's gonna be at least 120%. So they want to grow the financial market, they want to make like Vietnam financial market more transparent, of course more liquidity as well. We're trying to encourage more foreign investors to coming in, not just invest in infrastructure project, but also stock markets, public equity market, making the financial market in Vietnam more mature.
I think that the Asia Partners actually has done a great report where they charted out, like imagine like a chart. On one axis is very much like the country's GDP growth rate, and the other axis is the stock market growth rate. And what they shared is that historically, for example, Vietnam and China, the stock market has grown slower than the GDP growth rate, which means the proceeds or the net transfer of growth, the majority of that proceeds didn't go to the stock market. It went to the businesses or consumers or workers, private. And so I think from that perspective, they contrasted it against other Southeast Asian countries, but more like the US and other countries. So I think there's a point of view, and we'll put those charts into the transcript for people who want to check it out at w.com. But I think the crux of it was just that this report was basically saying you need to have that financial maturity to have that, but it's also a government regulator decision, which is, do I want to have proceeds go to the stock market? But of course, the benefit supposedly of giving those proceeds to the stock market is that the stock market will absorb and bring more foreign direct investment and more local retail investment into your public company. So it's supposed to be a virtuous cycle, but obviously it's still almost like a governance. Do you believe in capitalism? Because if you believe in capitalism, then that's the stock market and the classic Western style approach. London, New York, stock exchange. Actually, in Singapore, the stock exchange has not been doing well either. So I think the Singapore Stock Exchange has been doing a lot of work. The Singapore Venture Capital and Private Equity Association has also been working very hard to propose recommendations and set up a task force to advocate for the Singapore Stock Exchange, because the Singapore Stock Exchange is kind of like, unfortunately, like a lot of domestic startups, they're not listing in the Singapore Stock Exchange.
Is that like this because they cannot meet the requirements, or there's no liquidity?
Well, it's like a chicken and egg. So I think if you take the perspective of, I think, startup founders that hit a certain piece, I think what they're saying is, and you got to grow a certain way, and you're burning cash for quite a while, and then you want to go to the stock market when you're ready to raise money. But I think the simple fact is that actually New York is hard to beat, and everybody in Singapore can invest in a Singapore account to invest in America, etc. So there's nothing stopping a Singaporean retail investor from investing in the US. Does it make sense? So it's actually a perfect competition piece. It's less about Singapore being weak to some extent, but more like America is so strong with so much liquidity, so many market analyst reports, etc. So there's a lot there. So I think we recognize that primarily America's stock market is very strong, and there's no liquidity barriers between Singapore and the US. So I think that's the first piece. But I think the second piece is that from a founder perspective, the way they would argue it is like, if I'm going to IPO, I might as well IPO in the US. And if I have that IPO in the Singapore Stock Exchange one stage before, the restrictions are too high and the liquidity is not worth it for me to go IPO on the Singapore Stock Exchange one stage earlier. I think that's where a lot of the debate is happening right now. Because if you list those companies at the 200 million, 500 million, 1 billion valuation, which is a bit small for the US stock market, then you need to create a local industry of banking analysts who can write initiating coverage reports similar to the US. Then you need to get people to set up and explain, and you need strong CF that can hit the ground running and explain that story to people. And so there's a whole ecosystem, and only the government can really do that work, because you're basically saying, I'm going to subsidize or encourage banks to write reports about local Singapore companies. And because without that market information, how would somebody from the region feel comfortable investing in a Singaporean company at a 500 million valuation?
Yeah.
That's losing some money. So I suppose the Singapore Stock Exchange has the catalyst, which is supposedly for smaller companies, but so it's like 90 not there. And I think the Singapore government and the ministers have actually said they are setting up a roundtable or task force to figure out what to do.
I think that's necessary. Like, so it's also like a discussion of a new mandatory requirement that companies, regardless of the size, when they are listed in the stock exchange in Vietnam, have to file in both English and Vietnamese. So right now, some smaller size like are exempt from having both languages. So they only have Vietnamese filings. It's a step up for us, and I think it's necessary.
Yeah, because if it's not in English, then let me throw the ChatGPT. the ChatGPT hallucinated. It had an extra zero.
But also keep in mind, Vietnam stock market has opened up for the first time in 2000.
Yeah.
So it's still a very young market, financial market.
And I think the Singapore Stock Exchange has to move faster because if the Vietnam Stock Exchange is liberalizing, then last time, historically, there were some regional listings that will want to list in Singapore. But now, if you're Thai, you might as well just do it in the local Thai stock exchange, right? Which is actually quite a lot of Thai companies are listing the local Thai stock exchange, which is quite an interesting path. So they're listing at 50 mil, 100 mil, smaller basically. But I think the Thai local scene, from what I've heard, Wing was a co-host kind of shared about. It's just like a lot of the local Thais, they actually find it hard to access the US stock market as well. So they're investing in the domestic stock market. So there's a lot of capital and wealth flowing around. So it supports the domestic listing. So a Thai company can list in Thai. And it makes sense. A retail investor in Thailand would be like, hey, I understand a company, right? It's an F&B chain. There's a Thai dessert, right? Which is a real listing that happened. Then people list it and then people invest in it domestically, right? So why would a Thai company come to Singapore to list now? So soon if Vietnam does a good job of the stock exchange, the Vietnamese company would be like, you know what? I'll just list on the Vietnam stock exchange.
Next step for that to happen, if they need to remove the profitability requirement.
Oh, you should talk about the profitability requirement. There's a lot of crazy rules. What is the profitability requirement?
Oh, right now, if they are not profitable, it cannot be listed.
Yeah. I think that's also the Singapore rule. Obviously, the catalyst, which is the sub-listing, has a different set of rules. It's a different set of restrictions that make it almost equally as difficult, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So as a result, people are like, hey, I can be losing money and larger on the US stock market. I might as well go there. Is that profitable on the stock exchange? Or I can be unprofitable, but it hits such a crazy set of metrics from the founder's perspective that I might as well just eat 2 more years and grow into the US one, right? Anyway, but then again, I'm still quite sympathetic to regulator, right? Because if you're a Singapore Stock Exchange or any stock exchange, most of the investors are retail investors. They're not sophisticated or financially in the same way as an accredited full investor would be, right? So it looks quite bad actually if you list a company that's losing money, then everybody's like, wow, this pops 100%, 200%, and then the company collapses in 3 years. Like you're actually destroying some of the wealth of your local retail investors. So I understand the regulators.
So we are making reforms and transformation to the financial market. So I think it's still long-term. And we gotta stay patient. Even though there's been a lot of outflow from the stock market this year, especially, I think they'll come back eventually.
Okay. On that positive note, let's wrap up and I'll see you next month.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.